Thank you for tuning in. And we missed getting this teaching recorded on Sunday morning, but I felt it was so important on this topic of tenacious faith that I wanted to make sure that we got a recording of this. So regardless of where you may be, you can tune in and get this message. Have you ever noticed everywhere you go you have to wait? I mean, the construction zones, you have to wait. You go to Winco, load up your basket, you got to wait in line. The airport is the absolute worst. First, you got to go in and check your bags, and then you got to go through the detectors, and then you got to go to the terminal, and then you have to wait. Then you wait on the plane, and then on the other end, you got to wait for your suitcase to come off. There's a whole lot of waiting that goes on. In fact, did you know by the time you are 70 years of age, you will have spent 6 months of your life waiting at a stoplight? Waiting. Nobody enjoys that. You know, those casual periods of waiting. But the most difficult is, you know, when you're going through a difficult time, those waiting periods are faith-building seasons in life. All the best people in Scripture, they all spent periods of waiting. Abraham was 75 years old before he received the promise that he would be a father of a great nation, and then waited 24 years before the birth of the promised son. Moses was told that he would lead God's people out of slavery, and then it was 40 years. And then another 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. David was told that he would be the next king of Israel, and then spent 2 decades of waiting. You know, but today I want to talk with you about a woman in Scripture who spent 12 years waiting for her miracle. How long have you been waiting for your breakthrough, for your miracle? And, you know, your faith is what gets God's attention. Your faith gets God's attention, and it activates His power. And, you know, there's a story in the Bible about a woman who spent 12 years waiting. She had this bleeding issue for 12 long years. She'd been to the doctors. They couldn't do a thing for her. She only grew worse. And one day she hears this commotion in her town. She finds out Jesus is passing through. Now, she had heard stories about Jesus, how he had healed the crippled man, how he had opened the blind man's eyes, and something came alive in her. She thought, he did it for others, he can do it for me. She thought, if I could just get through this crowd, if I could just get to Jesus, even if I could just touch the hem of his robe, I believe I will be healed. The problem was there was this great crowd, thousands of people surrounding Jesus. The people were all packed in, and it seemed impossible. Most people would have given up, but not this lady. She started to make her way through the crowd. She was probably weak. She'd been bleeding for 12 years. She probably didn't feel like, you know, she had it in her to fight her way through the crowd, but she kept telling herself, I know if I can just get to Jesus, I'll be healed. She may have crawled even the last few feet. Scripture tells us that she reached through and touched the hem of his robe. That's obviously the bottom part of the robe. She may have crawled the last few feet. And all of a sudden, Jesus stopped in his tracks and asked the disciples, hey, who touched me? And they thought, well, look at this crowd. There's a lot of people that are touching you. But in effect, Jesus was saying this, no, there's people bumping into me. There's a lot of people brushing up against me. But this is different. Somebody just touched me. Somebody's faith drew the miracle-working power out of me. And Jesus saw her. At first she thought she'd done something wrong, and Jesus smiled at her and affirmed her and told her, your faith has made her whole. And I love what he said. This is in Mark chapter 5, verse 34. He says to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. You are freed from your suffering. Isn't that beautiful? Daughter, your faith has healed you. You know, the other day I was texting with my daughter, and, you know, in our English language, there are a few terms of endearment that are as poignant and tender and as powerful as the term daughter. And Jesus looks at this woman who believes that she had done something wrong. And he affirms her and says, "Daughter, your faith has healed her." See, her suffering was more than just physical. In the Middle East, women were treated like second-class citizens. You even see that today where women are disrespected and treated as second class. And that was no different back in Jesus' day. And in particular, a woman with an issue of blood that was likely associated with her menstrual cycle, which in that day she would have been considered unclean. And whoever she touched would be unclean. That may explain some of her stealthy approach of coming in and touching the hem of Jesus' garment. Maybe she could get through, unnoticed. But I love how Jesus was interested not only in her physical healing, but in her emotional healing as he turns to her, smiles, and affirms and says, "Daughter, isn't that beautiful?" In effect, he was saying, look, there's nothing so unclean about you that somehow you're going to make me unclean. Jesus said, your faith has healed you. Now, I'm sure her parents had taken her to church for prayer. She'd certainly been to the doctor. The text tells us that. But it was her faith that caught the attention of Jesus and activated and released his power. There were many people that day that were bumping into Jesus, brushing up against Jesus, but it was this woman that touched him. And so the question I have, are you just brushing up against him, or is your faith reaching out and getting his attention and touching his heart? Because it's your faith that touches his heart. Do you believe that God's bigger than your problems? I challenge you, press in to him. The question I have for you is, what obstacles are standing in your way? What's standing between you and Jesus? What's keeping you from pressing through and getting to him? Now, the crowd in her story represents the things that she needed to fight through. And it represents things that we need to fight through. You may need to fight through your disbelief, your lack of faith, where maybe you've prayed, you've had people pray for you, you've gone to the doctor, whatever the case might be, but you haven't got better, and so your faith level is low. Maybe you need to fight through your depression, the negative things that have been spoken to you, spoken over you. You may need to fight through your warped ideas of God, that somehow he's uptight, that he's angry at you. You've lost sight of the fact that he is the good Father, that he is the giver of good gifts. You see, for you to reach your destiny, you're going to have to fight through some things. You may get knocked down, but you're not knocked out. You get up. You keep pressing through. Do not let your mistakes, your guilt, your sin, your past keep you from getting to Jesus. This is a fascinating story because in many of Jesus' miracles, he would speak the word and they would be healed, or Jesus would lay his hands on the person and that person would be healed. The miracle would happen. But here in this story, she fights through the crowds and she goes and lays her hands on Jesus. We're often waiting for Christ to come lay his hands on us when he's saying, come, you come lay your hands on me. It's that kind of tenacious faith that touches God's heart. Your faith is a catalyst for God to do amazing things. The Bible tells us this, that it's your faith that pleases God. In Acts 14, there's a story where the Apostle Paul, he's preaching a message and it's getting late into the evening. And he notices in the crowd, he looks out and he can see something. Maybe it was in the man's eyes, maybe it was in his facial expression, but he recognized. And let me read it to you. It says, Paul looked directly at him and saw that he had faith to be healed. Paul was able to recognize this man in the crowd who'd been crippled since birth had faith to be healed. He was in the crowd, and as Paul preached, something in his heart was being stirred. He began to believe. He had faith to be healed, and Paul stopped his message midstream, called to the man to stand up, and he did. Paul is just preaching, and yet this man was believing. There was something in his face that Paul could recognize. This guy has faith to be healed. Now it says in Hebrews, without faith, it is impossible to please God. Let me repeat that. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists. Do you believe that God exists? And that he rewards those that earnestly seek him. Do you believe that God is a good, good Father? Do you believe that he is a rewarder of those who seek him? That he gives good gifts? That he is full of the favor of God and he wants to pour that out on your life? So your faith gets God's attention. Your faith pleases God. Do you believe he is a rewarder? Don't let the fact that you've been sick or that you've been stuck for extended periods of time cause you to lose faith. God is in this room. If you're driving in your car right now, he is with you. Jesus is with you right now. And I pray that your faith would reach out and touch him. See, you may ask the question, well, what if I believe and nothing happens? Well, what if you believe and it does? An expectant faith is evident in the way you look. You're going to look more positive when troubles come because you know that you serve the mountain-moving God. Faith is not believing in what you can do. It's believing for what God can do. Reach out and touch him. Anticipate the miracle. Lord, I thank you for opening the door that no man can shut. Lord, I thank you for making a way where there seemed to be no way. And you carry that expectancy as an expression on your faith, even though it's a difficult time. Your expectant faith is evident on your face, the way you carry yourselves. It may be difficult, but I know God's opening a door. I don't know how this is going to work out, but I know God is already behind the scenes making a way where it seems like there's no way. You have expectant faith. See, sometimes we're sitting there waiting for God to do something, and maybe he's waiting for you to do something. Maybe, like this woman, he's waiting for you to reach out and in faith lay your hands on him. That's exactly what Jacob did in the story. He was estranged from his brother. You remember the story where he had swindled his brother for the blessing. And his brother threatened his life, and so he fled and was living away for many, many years. And after he had burnt all of his bridges there, he realized he had no other choice but to head home. And as he was en route with his family, a large entourage, his family, he had heard that his brother had heard he was coming, and now Jacob got the message, your brother's coming out to meet you, and he has 400 men with him. Jacob was convinced he was going to be killed, that was going to be the end of his life right there. And so his stress level was high. And he was on one side of the Jabbok River, and his brother was on the other, and it was nighttime. And Scripture tells us in Genesis 32:26, he said, then the man said, let me go, for it's daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Let me unpack this narrative a little bit. Really, it's believed that who Jacob is wrestling with right there is Jesus Christ incarnate, who'd come in the Old Testament. And Jacob is wrestling with him through the night. He knows he's burnt all of his bridges. He's been the swindler. He's always found a way out of his trouble. And now he's run out of solutions. And so here he is. He's wrestling with God. And God says, hey, Jacob, let me go. It's daybreak. Now listen, God doesn't have a problem with you wrestling with him. And it tells us that God essentially spoke to him, hey, let me go. It's daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. This is the exact same tenacious spirit that woman had. She didn't wait for Jesus to lay his hands on her. She laid her hands on him. Stay in faith no matter what it looks like. And for you to kind of get to that place, it's when you finally ran out of solutions. The doctor couldn't help her. They took her to prayer, and that prayer didn't seem to work. And finally she said, I just need to get to Jesus with my own faith. It wasn't until she'd reached the end, it wasn't until Jacob had reached the end of himself that he wrestled tenaciously with God for his breakthrough. See, without faith, it is impossible to please God. But here's the key. If you don't believe that he is a rewarder of those who seek him, if you don't believe in the goodness and the kindness of God, if you believe that somehow he's upset and angry with you, then you're going to have a very difficult time having faith in him. See, in the story of the prodigal son, this son that took his inheritance and went to a foreign land, and he squandered it all on wine, women, and song. And here he is, he's broke. He has nothing left. And here's a Jewish boy who's longing to fill his stomach with the pig slop. And it says that he came to his senses, and he knew that he could go home. He said, even my father's hired hands have it better than this. He understood something about the goodness of his father. And it provided a safe environment for him to return and to be restored. But by contrast, the older brother who had stayed behind when he had heard about the celebration, the party going on, he goes to his father and he says, I have been slaving for you all of these years. I've been slaving for you. He had clearly had a very warped perception of who the father was. See, if you believe he's a father to be slaved for, that he's a taskmaster, then how would you ever come to him? If you believe that somehow you're so unclean that you kind of have to, come to him secretly in fear that somehow he may reject you, somehow you may defile him. Listen, you are wrong. He loves you. He rewards those who seek him. I challenge you, let your faith reach out and touch him. It gets his attention. It activates his power. God bless you. Thank you for tuning in and listening.